A series of bombings has ripped through Iraq, killing at least 66 people. Such coordinated attacks have become the hallmark of the country's al-Qaeda cell. Its bloody efforts to undermine the authority of the Iraqi government have already made this year the deadliest in the country since 2008. Well, let's look now at the roots of the crisis. From 1996 to 2001, al-Qaeda was based in Afghanistan, where it enjoyed the protection of the Taliban and was also present in Pakistan. Its expansion gathered steam after Washington launched its war on terror in response to the 9/11 attacks. The U.S. invasion of Iraq prompted radical Islamists there to declare their allegiance to Osama bin Laden's network in 2004. 2007 saw a powerful jihadist group in North Africa unite under the name of al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb and spread its operations across the region. 2 years later, the Yemeni and Saudi branches merged to form al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Since then, the terror networks been gaining ground, with new cells emerging in the region as the Arab Spring unfolded, including some powerful groups waging a war against President Assad in Syria. RT's Ganesh Chikyan investigates.
U.S. intelligence officials, speaking anonymously, of course, say they're now concerned that al-Qaeda-affiliated groups in Syria are shifting some of their focus from toppling Bashar al-Assad to launching external operations against the West. One U.S. lawmaker pointed out that's exactly what happened in Afghanistan, which led to 9/11. They're now focused on fighting Assad, but very soon they'll be focused on something else. We have Michael Maloof here, former Pentagon official, with me. Mr. Maloof, where are these al-Qaeda-affiliated groups headed, in your opinion?
The al-Qaeda, through al-Nusra forces that are there, are now attempting to look at Syria in the long term to be under a caliphate. And from there, they'll spring throughout the entire region. When you look at a map, that whole area stringing from the Arabian Peninsula to all the way across North Africa and into the Maghreb puts you right smack dab at the foot of southern Europe. And that is Zawahiri's strategy, is to ultimately move al-Qaeda into Europe.
According to various estimates, more than 10,000 committed al-Qaeda members are operating just along Syria's eastern border with Iraq. It's reported to be more than the number of jihadists in Iraq during the U.S.-led occupation. Worth mentioning, it was the U.S. invasion that brought terror into Iraq. This graph from the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism shows the spike of terrorist attacks in Iraq following the U.S. invasion. The U.S. now shrugs at all this terror that Iraq has to deal with every day, calling it, well, pains of democracy. Libya, similar attitude. The U.S. helped kill Gaddafi. Now the country is engulfed in chaos and terror. Again, you hear pains of democracy. But as these extremist groups in different countries become more and more organized as a network, it's difficult to ignore the monster that's spreading through the region. The U.S. thinks drones are the perfect tool to deal with terrorists. They say drones are the solution. But on the receiving end, those drone strikes are seen as acts of terror when they kill innocent people, and they help terrorists recruit more terrorists. Most recently, 2 reports came out by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. They looked into U.S. strikes in Pakistan and Yemen. Human Rights Watch found that in the strikes that they have investigated, 70% of those who died were civilians. Washington says they've decimated al-Qaeda's leadership, but it seems al-Qaeda has metastasized and continues spreading with drone strikes and brewing civil wars. In Washington, I'm Ganesh Chikyan.
George Kenney, who's a former diplomat in the U.S. Foreign Service, says there are inconsistencies in the decisions made by policymakers in Washington.
We should reasonably assume that within the U.S. government, they have exactly the same data. They know that the more that we attack terrorists the way that we're doing, the more terrorism appears. And so then the question is, well, if we're creating more terrorists through our anti-terrorism activities, why are we doing it? There's no sensible strategy. There's no consistent logical strategy behind U.S. actions. We're taking things one piece at a time. So here we support one group, there we suppress the same group. You know, here we talk about terrorists, and there we support terrorists in Syria. There's no real consistency, and that shows that's very strong proof that there's no thought behind what we're doing.
To discuss the situation further, I'm now joined live by journalist and broadcaster Neil Clark. Mr. Clark, how much of the turmoil and violence we're currently seeing in Iraq and Afghanistan directly blamed on NATO intervention?
I think they can all be directly blamed on the NATO interventions, because if we think back at these so-called interventions, then nearly all of them were billed as humanitarian ventures, weren't they? It was NATO, the benign NATO powers led by the United States, were going into these countries to liberate the people from these wicked dictators like Saddam Hussein, Mullah Omar or Colonel Gaddafi. And in every instance of these so-called interventions, the result has been death and destruction, has been absolute chaos. In Iraq, a new study said that at least 500,000 people have been killed since the invasion, and it could be even more. So I think that the consequences of these interventions have been anything but humanitarian. They've been war crimes, and I think that for people living in these countries, they've been a nightmare what's happened since these NATO interventions. So I think, yes, NATO is to blame.
You know, every day we hear reports of how many people are being targeted or die in Iraq. It's in the middle of its worst spike of violence in years. Has the war in neighbouring Syria further destabilised Iraq?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's no coincidence to me that there's been this huge spike in violence in Iraq since the destabilisation of Syria has taken place since 2011, of course, because the US has been helping Islamic terrorists there to try to topple the secular, independently minded government of President Assad. And it's no coincidence that there's been this huge spike in violence in Syria and in Iraq at the same time. Al-Qaeda groups are going from Iraq to Syria, from Syria to Iraq. The whole region is in turmoil because of the United States policies. And this is not a mistake. This is it is a mistake to think it's a mistake, if you like, because whenever the neocons come on to talk about Iraq, and of course they very rarely want to talk about Iraq, they always like to claim that, well, Tony Blair and George Bush wanted well, but they made a few mistakes along the way. That's nonsense. The whole aim of the exercise was to destroy Iraq as a functioning country, to make sure it can never again be a threat to regional powers that the US backs in that region. The same with Syria. So I think this is all deliberate. What we're talking about is a deliberate destruction of independently minded countries in this region.
Well, but these Western powers have been claiming that the fighting, against international terrorism, and yet they've now supported the rebels in both Libya and Syria. How would you explain that apparent contradiction?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's the biggest myth in the whole of international relations. The biggest myth is that the United States and its allies are implacably opposed to terrorist groups around the world, and particularly Al Qaeda and Islamic terrorist groups. They're not. They will use Al Qaeda and terrorist groups like them to help them to topple secular, independently minded governments like President Assad's in Syria, Gaddafi's in Libya and elsewhere. But they will also use the presence of Al-Qaeda groups in order to intervene in countries where they want regime change as well, like Mali, for example, and in Afghanistan. So, in fact, the West uses Al-Qaeda, uses Islamic groups. They're not implacably opposed to them. That's a great myth. Nobody has done more to boost the rise of Al-Qaeda in the last 20 years than the United States. That's the fact.
And speaking of Al-Qaeda, it seems to be expanding itself as a network, becoming more organized. Is there any way to stop it from getting any bigger from what it is right now?
It goes back to the US. I don't think the US wants to stop it. I think, Al-Qaeda serves a very useful purpose for American foreign policy and for Israel too, and for Saudi Arabia. The fact is that if Al-Qaeda didn't exist, it would have to be invented. It serves an awful lot of good purposes for the United States to push its agenda around the world. And I think there's got to be a sea change in the US. If the US was really serious about Al-Qaeda and wanting to deal with it, they would do. They wouldn't be supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria. They wouldn't be wanting a secular regime in Syria to be toppled. They would be actually supporting President Assad in Syria. They wouldn't have been wanting regime change in Libya, would they? So I think that, to answer your question, the future of Al-Qaeda depends on the US. The US helped create Al-Qaeda and this Islamic terrorism, and it's up to the US to stop it if it really wanted to, but their policies show that they're not really interested in doing that, I'm afraid.
Neil Clark, journalist and broadcaster, they're giving his thoughts on what's happening there in Iraq.